In the reading corner today, I'm thrilled to be welcoming Dom Conlon, a poet and former copywriter. We're going to be talking about Dom's two most recently published books. They're Leap, Hare, Leap, an illustrated book, illustrated by Anastasia Isilsu and published by Graphic. We're also going to be talking about This Rock, That Rock, which is illustrated by Vivian Schwartz and published by Troika. These books are actually connected by a love of the natural world and by the word leap. Well, leap, hare, leap, you might say that's pretty obvious, but why this rock, that rock? Well, of course, the minute we start thinking about the moon, we recall that phrase that Neil Armstrong allegedly said as he stepped out onto the surface of the moon: one small step for man, a giant leap for mankind. Welcome, Dom.
Hi, Nikki. Lovely to be here.
And I understand that you're actually out in the open today as we're recording, somewhere near Kirby Lonsdale.
I'm in Kirby Lonsdale, just below Devil's Bridge by the river, and it's absolutely beautiful.
Sounds lovely. Tell me a little bit about that connection, that word leap. Is it a deliberate connection, or did it just leap out at me as I was reading them?
No, it wasn't deliberate. And I'm going to use that a lot because I'm using the word leap more and more, it seems. Not necessarily consciously, but I'm finding that it's a great connective word to get into all the things that interest me about space and about nature and just the world around me. But one thing I did find about it, and the quote that you're using from Neil Armstrong, and I love saying this to children when I go into schools, but it's also the first two lines of a haiku that I've written in the book. And so all I had to do to finish that poem was find 5 syllables and to complete it. And I think I put historic moon words, and it just completed the haiku and gave me a poem that Neil Armstrong mostly wrote, but it's in my book, not his, so it's good.
Well, that's quite a nice link, because I wanted to talk about compression and concentrated language. And I'm not surprised to hear that you were a copywriter in a former life, because although these forms of writing might seem to some to be absolutely worlds apart, the poet and the kind of copywriter, there are connections, aren't there?
There are. So certainly with my approach to copywriting, one thing that you try and do is form a kind of emotional link between in copywriting, it's the consumer, but your audience, and the emotional heart of whatever it is you're talking about. So you're doing it in as fewer words as possible, as concisely as possible, and with that emotional and intelligent sort of combination that works to best in any communication. It's the heart and the head kind of connection to whatever the subject matter is. But yeah, so with video games, you were trying to get that emotional link to whatever game it was that I was working on, and we worked on all sorts, right across from Resident Evil to some Cartoon Network, Ben 10 and things like that. So we did quite a lot.
Okay, talking about leaps, it's going to be quite a leap from Resident Evil to Leap, Hare, Leap. Now, the hare is such a fascinating character. I think when I initially contacted you, I said how glad I was to see a book about the hare. We used to have them close by to where we live, and they're just such intriguing, mysterious animals. People think of them as being like rabbits, but they're not, are they?
Everybody knows when they've seen a hare. If you're in any doubt, then you've not seen a hare. And I think I would add to your list of adjectives, I would add the word mystical, because I think they are incredibly mystical animals. And when you see one, and I saw one it was only about 5 years ago, maybe even fewer, on a car park in a nature reserve not far from where I live. And you're just in its spell, you're transfixed. The only other animal I've ever experienced a similar thing with is a deer. And they just seem to be kind of portals into an ancient and a magical time. It just seems to connect with you straight away. It's just unmistakable, its form and its poise. Very different animals. Beautiful, beautiful.
And then when you see them move and the eyes are like nothing
Oh.
else. Oh, wonderful. Actually, I've just thought there's another connection, of course, because, and you talked about the word mystical, but some people say that it's not a man in the moon, but a hare in the moon.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And there are lots of kind of these folk tales of hares and moons that connect it. So the way hare came about actually is through, I'd written a book, and I often kind of just write something that interests me. I just put it on my website and said, here's a book about foxes that you can read if you want. And I think one of our finest poets and nature writers, Nicola Davis, read it. And she just said to Graph-Egg, you've got to read this. And they phoned me up and said, we've just commissioned a lot of books about foxes. Would you consider writing about hares? I said, yep, no problem. And I went away, completely rewrote it and reimagined it. But the more I read about hares, you just can't help but fall in love with them.
So I hadn't realised actually that there were all these hares all over the world. And I hadn't realised that the American jackrabbit is actually a hare too. So did you have to go off and, as you were changing from writing about foxes to hares, did you have to do this kind of research which took you into different parts of the world?
I knew what I wanted to do because I was the same. A hare is a hare. And then when I discovered actually a hare isn't just a hare, and that you've got these extraordinary animals which have had to adapt to their surroundings, their environments, and do so in the most extraordinary ways. This is an animal that, unlike a rabbit, doesn't burrow. It lives in what's called a scrape or a form. And so it's just a dent in the land. And so you're giving birth to your young. They've got to be ready to run and to leap and to fend for themselves at a very, very early age. They've not got that protection of the burrow that a rabbit has. And so I thought this is a kind of natural story, not just for hares, but for kind of a lot of other animals and how they adapt to the climates and the environments that they're in, whether that's deep snow or desert or woodlands or mountain regions. And they're as varied as the terrains that we find them in. And I think that's an amazing thing, how everything adapts to survive and to live in harmony and make the most of its surroundings.
So I was interested in the kind of structure that you chose for this. Your fox still manages to creep into the story.
Yes.
He's actually hunting the hare, and she leaps off, but into one of these other countries where these other types of hare are, and that's the sort of format that you came up with. Tell us a little bit about that idea.
So with the poetry side of my writing, I wanted to create something that didn't shy away from being magical, but which didn't interrupt with the science either or conflict with it. So I just thought this device of it needs to move around the world. Let's have it so that when it jumps up, because hares are extraordinary at jumping. When they leap, they can leap something like 3 meters in the air. And I thought I want to exaggerate this in a way that it's obvious that this isn't scientific, but yet is still in the spirit of the writing and the poetry. So, and that very simple device, more or less every 2 spreads, gives me the ability to quickly change scene, to give variety for Anastasia, to illustrate in her incredible art, and to keep things kind of moving around without stopping and starting and saying, well, that was the brown hare and that lives over there. This is the Arctic hare and this lives over here. I wanted that whole seamless kind of flow to the story.
Something else that you seem to be very fond of in your writing, which I will tell you I appreciate it because my maiden name is Kenning. And you are a great user of kennings. What is it about that poetic form that you really love, or that poetic device that you really love?
In 2 words, a kenning can capture the absolute essence of anything. And it's an extra, and I mean, you know this, I'm sure, but it's a very old form of writing. It's an Anglo-Saxon in origin, and you would have entire poems built from kennings, and it just seems a very immediate and very tangible kind of thing, in a way that metaphors and similes aren't. In it's much more direct, and obviously we're brought up showing how metaphors are very direct forms of imagery, but a kenning seems to be even more so. And when I'm in schools and we're talking about it, I said I'm a big fan of kennings, and a lot of the time I find that the children are not aware of kennings, and I think they're more difficult to understand in a way than a metaphor. More difficult because you can't have to describe a tree. Children might say brown stick. I said, well, that can apply to so many things. So my example that I use for a child in year 5 in a school in Chorley that I went to years ago, and I asked just a kenning for a whale, and one child just straight away, ocean balloon, and I just thought that is just magical. I think that just sums up the joy of seeing a whale, the size of the whale, the bobbing about of a whale. So I think there's a lot of fun to be had with kennings.
So just to give our listeners an idea here, your hare is a firm-footed leaper and a whiskered dawn dancer. Just beautiful. And grammatically it's interesting too, because essentially they're just nouns.
Yeah, and it's that thing, isn't it, of how simple language can be, or how it doesn't need to be complicated. We don't need, I know a lot of writers rail against adverbs, and yet schools teach them, and that's fine, because you know, we should know we should know all the tools. One thing I talk about in poetry is having poetry has tools, not rules, and I think if we're aware of tools like kennings, then it just makes our conversations more interesting, and it makes our imagery more powerful.
So I heartily recommend Leap Hare Leap to people listening into our podcast, but I want to turn for a moment to This Rock, That Rock. Now, this is a collection of poems themed around the moon. To begin, I was just interested whether you were writing for a collection, or whether over a period of time you've just discovered that you'd got lots of moon poems and thought this would be a good collection.
It was for a collection. This was probably 5 years ago, so we were coming up to the 50th anniversary of the first landing on the moon, and I said I'd like to write poems in honour of that, and looking ahead to the future of the moon, and I said, because it inspires me. The moon, looking up into space and into the sky at night, just inspires me. So I said I'd like to write 50 poems for the 50 years, and I wrote those from various points of view, from personal points of view, but also in different style, depending what the poem seemed to suggest it wanted from me.
So it seems to me that I've already said that there's an obvious love of the natural world, and hearing you talk, I can hear that coming through as well as off the page. But there also seems to me to be a fascination with technology as well. That comes through in your collection of poetry. Yeah. Do you see that there's a tension between those?
I see there's a lot. So I love space exploration, but at the same time, we've got to go into these things with our eyes open and realize the damage. I mean, you know, we've got satellites that go around the Earth and tell us so much about climate change, and yet launching a rocket in order to put that satellite up burns so much fuel, eye-watering amounts of fuel, which contribute towards global warming and climate change. And I think we've got to be aware of this and not shy away from the fact that with every thing that makes us perhaps feel a sense of wonder, there is also a great responsibility to the natural world, from exploring space to managing our waterways and our farms, because they affect everything. You know, we've got to walk lightly upon this planet in order to preserve this wonder that is inspiring us, and I know space exploration's brought great advances in technology which will help recycling water and making us more efficient as a species. But to get there, it's also, there's a great cost as well.
That brings me nicely to what I hope you're going to do, which is read a poem for us. I detected a number of themes coming through the book, and one of them was just about admiration and awe for our planet and for the moon as well. And I chose a poem that I hoped that you would read for us. It's called This Rock, That Rock.
I would absolutely love to, because you're right, there is a sense of awe about this. And the fact that this moon, this slightly oversized moon of ours, is what is responsible for life being able to exist the way it does is just extraordinary. So yeah, I will read This Rock, That Rock. This rock is big, that rock is small. This rock is blue, that rock is grey. This rock has trees, that rock has rocks. This rock has rainbows, that rock has shadows. This rock has seasons, that rock does not. This rock has oceans of water, that rock has seas of dust. This rock is wrapped in a blue sky, that rock is loose within a black void. This rock orbits that sun, that rock orbits this rock. This rock is loud with stories and songs, that rock is as silent as a full stop. This rock has mountains filled with wealth, that rock has craters made poor by meteors. This rock is home to 7 billion lives as brief as footprints in sand. That rock is home to footprints as long-lasting as history. This rock is a planet. That rock is a moon. This rock is overflowing with life. That rock is what makes life on this rock possible.
Now, I love many poems in this collection, but the reason that I chose that one, well, there were numerous. One is that it has an apparent simplicity to it. And indeed, it starts very simply with these contrasts. But the further you go into the poem, the way that it's structured, it just takes you deeper and deeper into thought. And it's one where you reach the end and you just want to think about what those final lines mean.
Because it is an extraordinary relationship with, and I think this applies to every relationship really. Our relationship with the natural world, our relationship with the people around us, in that we all make it possible for the others to exist. And we've got to be aware that we're not existing in isolation. And it's the same with the moon. You know, the moon steadies the wobble of the earth scientifically. We do have a slight wobble as we turn, but without the moon, that would be much more exaggerated, and therefore you'd have wildly extreme seasons. Obviously, the tides are also led by the moon as that moves around, and all these things are what give life to us. So I think that poem that really taps into that responsibility that we've got with the world around us.
There are other poems that really invite us to look at the moon. So there's that lovely poem in a kind of mystical way, Moon Frost, Solar Eclipse. And then there are poems that seem to be about shared experience. And I think you have one that you've chosen to read to us.
Yes, so I'm going to read. I'm away on holiday at the moment. Me and my son are going to Kirby Lonsdale. And we've got a good kind of a father-son sort of friendship going on, in that he likes to play his video games. I like to kind of lean up against him and write whilst he's doing that. And sometimes we'll just speak, and it's a lovely, quiet kind of thing going on. And we also like to go camping and sit by the fire and do similar sort of things. So this one's called Between You, Me and the Moon. And it's about me when I look across at Oliver and think how he's changing and growing and what effect that will have on our sort of relationship. It gets darker later, now that your summer is here, but I watch cool winds carry dandelion embers to your hair, whilst the stars I used to sing stay faded in the air. We sit together less often, and tonight's moon is hard to find, but the old campfire still recalls your bedtime books in the theatre of its flames, whilst the snap of wet wood brings slammed doors to mind. You talk of new planets, as I try to hold to the old, and the light of birthday candles, torches intense, and your bike's backlight takes longer to arrive. There's too much space, and yet not enough for all you've become. I cannot keep you with the names of constellations, and yet we talk of everything between you, me, and the moon.
That's just beautiful.
Thank you.
Those shared experiences, so special, aren't they?
They really are.
We've got these deeply personal poems. We've got this wonder of the moon. And then, as I said earlier, there is this appreciation of the achievement of it all and getting somebody to the moon. I loved the way that you included the poem Humankind. Mankind is the name of the poem, isn't it? It ends with humankind because you remind us of all the women that were actually involved in that tremendous achievement.
Yes. And, there's a great documentary series on Netflix called Connected. And one of the episodes is about clouds. And he talks about the way weather forecasts came about. And I was taken back into my book when I heard him talk about how the original calculators to work out the weather across the entire world were basically an army of women doing incredible maths to predict future weather patterns. And it is an aspect of history that has always been there, but never, ever acknowledged, never celebrated. But now with things like Hidden Figures, and there's lots of wonderful books now for children where you can access the biography of people like Margaret Hamilton, without whom you would not be able to have put people on the moon at all. I think it's extraordinary.
I feel there's so much more that I want to talk to you about your collection. I think I just want to briefly mention that Vivian, we talked about the illustration of Leap Hare Leap. I do want to mention that I think Vivian Schwartz has done a great job in illustrating poetry, because some of them are quite suggestive, which doesn't interfere too much with your own interpretation of the poem. And I think that's quite a skill to illustrate poetry.
I think Vivian is one of the most remarkable artists I've ever met, the way she thinks. And she was as instrumental to editing the poetry in the book as I was. One example of that, there's a poem in there about my brother who died when he was 17. He had muscular dystrophy and he was severely autistic. And I'd written this poem called The Autism and Dystrophy of Brother Moon. And after quite a while, Vivian just said to me, I don't think that's the right title. And this is a brave kind of thing to suggest to the poet, because she knew how personal it was. And we talked about autism, and my experience of autism is very different to other people's, because Sean, my brother, if we went a certain way to the shops, it would be the blue way, or Dominic's going the red way now. And it was all done in this kind of language that was really interesting language of how he saw the world. But for somebody to say, actually, this poem, which is incredibly personal about the death of your brother, I think you should change it, is an amazing strength that Vivian had. And I looked at it and immediately I thought, she's absolutely right. That title was the scaffolding in which helps me to write the poem. But now I can take that away, because the poem stands on its own. And that's why in the book it's called Brother Moon. And it's enough. It's absolutely enough.
Fantastic.
And Vivian helped me with the language for the poem that you mentioned about mankind and humankind. We talked about gender and issues of gender in that. And everything, that whole book is as good as it is because of Vivian. It really is. She cut up the poems into individual poems, put them in a little box, and then she said she'd be walking around with this box in her bag, take it out, pull out a poem, a random poem, and think about it and carry it with her, and then create the amazing art using so many different techniques of illustration. There's brush, there's collage, there's the handprint moon on the cover. There's so many different things. It's just extraordinary work. It really is.
Fantastic. Really nice to hear that. Just before we close, I want to mention to teachers that one of the things that they will appreciate, as well as children, at the back of the book are your notes about poems with kind of a suggestion about how this might spark children's own interest, which I thought was a really nice touch as well. Now, can I just ask whether there are going to be more books in the Leap Hare Leap series?
There are, actually. I've written another one, and that's, I suppose this is the advertising copywriter in me. I've created a brand kind of catch-all thing called Natural Wanderers, and I think there will be 10 books in the series, and they will look at everything, other animals, but other aspects of nature, trees, the wind, all sorts of things, where we'll look at it in a similar way to see how it is either across the world or within its own environment, but over time, all different kind of ways, but to look at the wider implications of the subject. The one I've just written is called Swim Sharks Swim, and that goes around the world, so it looks at all different kinds of species and sea life as well. So I'm very excited about that.
Sounds absolutely great. Dom, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I feel we just scraped the surface today. So maybe there'll be another time in the future where we can dig even deeper. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.